I stood at the edge of the sidewalk, watching as the streetlights flickered and hummed in the quiet night. My heart thumped hard in my chest, not from the cold, but from the familiar yet strange mixture of emotions swirling inside me. It felt like something big was about to happen, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. A deep breath helped calm my nerves, but the sensation didn't fade. I was standing in front of Oliver's house again, just like so many times before, but tonight, everything felt different. The conversation we'd had earlier that day echoed in my mind. We talked about everything, but also nothing at all. It was like we were both dancing around a question neither of us wanted to ask, yet both of us needed the answer to. I had to admit it. I was scared. Scared of what we might discover about each other. Scared of what might change. And most of all, scared of the way my heart raced every time I thought about him. I had spent years with Oliver, but in the last few days, everything had shifted. There had been a moment, a single conversation that had turned everything upside down. And now, standing outside his house, I was about to find out what would happen next. Just as I was about to knock, the door opened, and there he was. Oliver, standing in the doorway with that same crooked smile I had seen 100 times, but this time, there was something else in his eyes. It wasn't just the usual warmth, the playful confidence that always made me feel safe. No, there was something deeper, something raw. "Hey," he said, his voice soft, but with an underlying tension. "You made it." I nodded, my throat dry. "Yeah," I muttered, trying to ignore the strange sensation creeping up my spine. I followed him inside, the familiar scent of his house immediately filling my senses. It felt like home, but tonight, even that was different. We sat down on the couch in his living room, the space between us uncomfortably vast. There was something unspoken hanging in the air, thick and heavy, like neither of us knew what to say next. The silence stretched out longer than I anticipated, and I could feel my palms growing sweaty. Oliver finally broke the silence. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it was enough to make my pulse quicken. "I've been thinking a lot about us," he said, his gaze meeting mine. "About everything that's been happening." I swallowed hard, trying to gather my thoughts. "Me too," I replied, my voice shaking slightly more than I'd intended. "I don't know what this is, but it's something." He sighed, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. "I don't know either, but I know I don't want to lose you." His words hit me like a tidal wave, the weight of them sinking in almost immediately. I had thought about it too, wondered if what we had, our friendship, our bond, was something that could survive the tension between us. But hearing him say it out loud made my heart race in a way that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. "I don't want to lose you either," I whispered, feeling the words slip out before I could stop them. It was the truth, and I realized that I was afraid of whatever was happening between us, but I was also drawn to it. Like I had been waiting for this moment my entire life, and now that it was here, I couldn't look away. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't heavy. It felt different, like we were both coming to terms with something. I could feel the tension between us, but now there was understanding too. We were both in the same place, even if we didn't fully know what that place was yet. A few moments later, Oliver stood up, his expression serious but kind. "Do you want to come upstairs? We can talk more." I hesitated for a split second before nodding. We had always shared things in that room, the room where we'd spent countless hours talking about everything and nothing, where we'd laughed until our stomachs hurt. But tonight, it felt like stepping into unknown territory. A place neither of us had visited before, a place where our friendship was suddenly fragile. As we climbed the stairs, I felt my nerves intensify. We were getting closer to a conversation that might change everything. The door to his room creaked open, and I stepped inside, taking in the familiar surroundings, the posters on the walls, the clutter on the desk, the bed where we had spent so many late nights talking about our hopes and dreams. But now, everything seemed different. The room felt smaller somehow, more intimate, and the air between us crackled with something I couldn't quite place. Oliver closed the door behind us softly, the faint sound of it locking in my ears like a finality. He stood near the edge of the bed, his posture tense but steady. "Do you ever wonder if this is something we don't have to ignore?" he asked, his voice low and tentative. I blinked, not sure how to respond. "What do you mean?" I asked, though a part of me already knew the answer. He took a deep breath, looking at me with a mixture of uncertainty and hope. "I mean, this. Whatever this is between us, it doesn't have to be something we push away. We could figure it out." I felt my pulse quicken as I tried to find the right words. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think about it, but I'm scared." He smiled, though it was small and unsure. "Me too," he admitted, walking closer. "But maybe it's time we stop pretending it's not there." The air in the room felt thick, charged with an intensity that was both comforting and terrifying. I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear I felt bubbling inside me. But there was something else too, something stronger, something that made it impossible to ignore. "I'm scared too," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't ignore it anymore either." And with that, everything changed. There was no going back. We were standing at the edge of something neither of us fully understood, but we both knew we couldn't pull away now. Oliver closed the gap between us, his hand reaching out to gently brush against my arm. His touch sent a shock of electricity through me, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. His gaze never left mine as he slowly leaned in, as if waiting for me to pull away. But I couldn't. I didn't want to. The kiss was slow, tentative at first, as if we were both trying to make sense of what was happening. But it deepened quickly, and everything else fell away. The fear, the confusion, the tension, it all melted into something much more powerful. And as we kissed, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. We pulled back after a few moments, both of us breathless, our hearts racing in unison. Neither of us said anything for a long time, but the silence was comfortable, not awkward. We didn't need words to understand what had just happened. It was as if we had both finally acknowledged something that had been lingering in the air between us for far too long. "I don't know what this means," I said quietly, breaking the silence. "But I know I don't want to lose you." Oliver smiled, a small, reassuring smile that made my heart flutter. "You won't," he replied, squeezing my hand. "We'll figure it out together." And for the first time in a long time, I believed him. The days after that night felt like a strange blur-like we were walking on the edge of something both familiar and completely unknown. I wasn't sure what to make of it, and I didn't know if Oliver knew either. The air between us was still heavy, but in a different way now. It wasn't filled with uncertainty or fear. Instead, it was charged with the weight of something we hadn't quite figured out yet, but both of us knew we couldn't ignore it anymore. I spent the next few days trying to get back to normal, trying to convince myself that things hadn't changed, but the truth was, nothing felt the same. Every time I saw Oliver, whether it was in passing or when we sat down to talk, my heart raced in a way that I couldn't control. And I could see the same thing in him, the way his eyes lingered just a moment too long, the subtle nervousness in his smile. It was clear that we were both trying to make sense of what had happened between us. It wasn't long before we had another conversation, this time in a coffee shop, sitting across from each other, both of us holding mugs that had long since gone cold. Neither of us spoke for the longest time, just staring at the steam rising from our cups. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. Finally, Oliver broke it, his voice quieter than I expected. "I don't want this to be a mistake," he said, looking up at me with a mixture of hope and concern. "What happened between us, it's big, it changes things, and I'm not sure what that means for us." I swallowed hard, my fingers curling around the mug as I tried to gather my thoughts. "I don't want it to be a mistake either," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "But I don't know what we're supposed to do now. I mean, we've always been friends. What happens when you cross that line?" Oliver shifted in his seat, leaning forward slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. "I don't know, but I'm not willing to just walk away from it. Whatever this is, I want to figure it out, together." The words hung in the air for a moment, and I realized how much I had needed to hear them. Maybe it wasn't just the fear of the unknown that had been holding me back. Maybe it was the fear that, if we didn't say anything, nothing would ever change. But now it felt like we were finally taking that step, even if neither of us knew exactly where we were going. "I don't know if I'm ready for it," I said honestly, the words coming out faster than I intended. "But I don't want to lose you either. Not like this, not after everything we've been through." Oliver's expression softened, and he reached across the table, his hand hovering for a moment before resting on mine. "We're not going to lose each other," he said, his voice steady. "We'll figure it out, I promise." It was a promise that felt heavier than any I had made before, and for the first time in days, I believed it. There was still so much uncertainty ahead, but we were in it together. And somehow, that made it feel a little less scary. The next few weeks passed in a blur of awkwardness and excitement. We talked more, but every conversation felt like we were skirting around something, avoiding the elephant in the room. Neither of us wanted to put labels on it, but we also couldn't pretend like things were exactly the same. Every time we met up, whether it was for a walk or a late-night movie, there was this underlying current between you, something we both acknowledged, but hadn't fully explored yet. And then, one afternoon, it happened again. We were sitting on the couch in his living room, talking about everything and nothing, as we always had. But this time, there was something different in the way we were looking at each other. The tension was palpable, thick in the air, and it was clear that we couldn't avoid it any longer. "I can't keep pretending like everything's the same," I said suddenly, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "I can't ignore what's happening between us. Not anymore." Oliver looked at me, his gaze intense but understanding. "I don't want to pretend either," he said quietly, his voice steady. "But I think we're both scared. Scared of what this means, scared of where it might go." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah, I'm scared, but I don't want to run from it. I don't want to lose you." He reached for my hand, his fingers brushing against mine, sending a shock of electricity through me. "You won't lose me," he said softly. "We'll figure this out, together, no matter what happens." And in that moment, everything felt like it was falling into place. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. Whatever this was, whatever we were becoming, it was something we both wanted to explore, even if we didn't know exactly what it meant. A few days later, I was standing outside his house again. But this time, it didn't feel like I was on the edge of something. It felt like I was stepping into it, ready to face whatever was coming. And when Oliver opened the door, that same crooked smile was on his face. But there was something else there, now something stronger, something deeper. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice soft but full of confidence. I nodded, my heart racing in my chest. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady despite the excitement I felt inside. "I think so." He stepped aside, letting me into the house, and as we moved to the living room, I realized something. It wasn't just about crossing a line. It was about taking the next step. And for the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. We sat down on the couch again, but this time, the silence between us wasn't uncertain. It was filled with promise. The tension, the fear, the confusion, it was all still there, but it was no longer overwhelming. We had made it through the hardest part. "I don't know what happens next," I said, my voice low. "But I know that I'm not afraid of it anymore." Oliver turned to me, his eyes soft and reassuring. "Neither am I," he replied. And for the first time in what felt like forever, everything felt okay. We didn't have all the answers, and the future was still uncertain. But we had each other, and that was enough.